In today's Author's Salon, we hear from Mr. Henry David Thoreau, one of the great literary lights of 19th century New England. One has to admire a man who fails to pay his taxes only out of principle. Thoreau comes to us from the great outdoors, as always, bursting with enthusiasm. Enjoy.
We should go forth on the shortest walk, perchance in the spirit of undying adventure, never to return, prepared to send back our embalmed hearts only as relics to our desolate kingdoms. I've been having a grand saunter. Here in the woods, I feel my life slow down. I always wanted a broad margin for my life. Here in the woods, I can feel the margins of my life expand. My parents first brought me here when I was 5 years old. This woodland vision for a long time made the drapery of my dreams. I can't remember a time when my soul didn't feel the tug of these woods. Their silence, their stillness. I was 27 years old when I built a cabin here. I lived here for 2 years. From the 4th of July, 1845 to the 6th of September, 1847. During those 2 years, Edgar Allan Poe published The Raven. Samuel Morse sent the first telegraph message. Giuseppe Verdi's Macbeth debuted in Florence, and the first recorded baseball game was played. But I had greater matters to attend to. I was planting a bean field just beyond the cabin over there, watching it grow. I was rich here, if not in money, in sunny summer days, and I spent them lavishly. Now, it wasn't all daydreaming and farming, though. No, I had 2 of the most productive years of my life here. I was writing. There are only a handful of books written by Americans in the 1800s which can claim indisputable status as classics. Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and my book, Walden. Oh, pardon my manners. They're a little rusty. Waldo Emerson used to tell me I spent too much time in my own company, which, well, maybe I did. Permit me to introduce myself. My name is Henry David Thoreau. Now, it's pronounced Thoreau, not Thoreau, but most people get it wrong. It's actually David Henry, but I always preferred the fine New England ring of Henry to the biblical David. Well, not that I have anything against the Bible. My mother had me memorize large portions of it as a child, and I'd have done anything for her. I'll take the truth wherever I can find it, so long as I'm convinced it is the truth. I never much liked anyone telling me what I should think. Still don't. But I digress. Walden. Now, Walden was not my first book. That was A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. It was published by James Monroe, who was so confident of its success that he insisted I pay the costs for printing it. He was extraordinarily wise. In its first year, it sold 218 copies. The earnings didn't even cover what it cost to warehouse what we couldn't sell, so he decided to burn the rest. I asked him instead to ship the remaining 782 copies to me, at my expense, of course, which he did. I thus had a library of nearly 900 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself. So you can imagine why any publisher would be wary of the new book from Henry Thoreau. Took me 5 years to find a publisher for Walden. Came out in August of 1854. Was 37 years old. It sold 344 copies that year, for which I was paid 15 cents each. I'll save you the arithmetic. It's $51.60, or about 2 months' wages for the average farm worker in those days. Took another 4 years to sell the remaining of that printing. You can imagine the effect of that on an author's estimate of his own work. But time, after all, is the only quite honest and trustworthy judge. And time has spoken. Walden has never been out of print. It's been reprinted in more than 150 different editions, about one new edition for every year since I wrote it. Not that it did me much good. But now the remaining copies of that first printing are the prized possessions of museums, and the proceeds from the sale of one would net you enough to cover tuition at your finest colleges and universities, with money to spare for paper and pencils, or whatever you use today. So, why has Walden endured? What's it about? Well, it's about priorities. It's about sifting the wheat of life from the chaff, the essential from the irrelevant, the light from the shadows. It asks how and to what purpose a man shall live his life, and attempts not simply to answer the question, but to provide an account of living the answer. I require of every writer, first or last, a simple and sincere account of his own life, not merely what he's heard of other men's lives. I wrote the first of the 8 or 9 drafts of Walden here, and I named it for the pond you can see just down there through the trees. Now, I did spend a good bit of my time here on those drafts of Walden, but that was not the only work I was inspired to write during my years here. Toward the end of July 1846, as I was walking back to Walden from Concord with a shoe I'd left for repair, I was arrested by Sam Staples, our local jailer. He was a good fellow, Sam, just doing his job. But why was I arrested? Are you familiar with the poll tax? It's the act whereby the government charges you to cast your vote. Now it's been declared unconstitutional, but it wasn't in the 1840s. I once declined to pay it for 6 years before they caught up with me. Now, I had never declined paying the highway tax. I was as desirous of being a good neighbor as I was of being a bad subject. But I was not interested in providing my support to a government engaged in an unjust war under the guise of national security. And I was not going to support, through finance or any other support, a government that supported the institution of slavery. So, I was arrested. Sam walked me back to the Concord jail, where I was his guest for the evening. As I stood, considering the walls of solid stone 2 or 3 feet thick, and the iron grating which strained the light, I couldn't help but be struck by the foolishness of an institution that regarded me as mere flesh and blood and bone to be locked up. I wondered that it could have concluded at length that this was the best use it could put me to. Now, there was a stone wall between me and my townsmen, but there was a still more impregnable wall to climb or break down before they could be as free as I was. I was a free man again, in a nation where 4 million people were owned by other people. I felt as if I alone of all my townsmen had paid my tax, and I said as much and considerably more on the floor of the Concord Lyceum in January of 1849. When I get going, I do tend to go on for quite a bit. The published version of that speech was over 10,000 words. It was published originally under the name Resistance to Civil Government, but it later became known as Civil Disobedience. I'm told that it has become the most widely read statement of the duties and obligations of a just man to an unjust government. And 20 years after it was written, a man who would carry a copy of it with him all his life was born in India. Using the principles I advocated, he led his people to freedom after more than 3 centuries of colonial exploitation. You've probably heard of him. He believed that a man who governs himself is governed well. They called him the Mahatma, the wise one. Now, that was not the only speech I wrote for the Concord Lyceum. I was never much of a joiner, but if I were to take part in any cause, it would be the one that's most free to entertain thought. The Underground Railroad was something else, something that a thinking man could be proud to participate in, something a thinking man could not avoid participating in. When I was a boy, my family and I sheltered and helped transport several men who had escaped from slavery. Many years later, one even stayed here in Walden Woods with me. Then, in 1859, came the meteor. Well, that's what Herman Melville called him. His name was Captain John Brown. John Brown had an old idea: do as you would be done by. With his 6 sons and his small following of loyal men, while the rest of the North wrung its hands and wondered what was to be done about slavery, Brown and his men took arms, intending to take over the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Northern Virginia, intending to arm and free the slaves he was sure would come to him. The men who did come to him were actually United States Marines commanded by Colonel Robert Edward Lee, who was soon to do a great deal more trouble by turning his back on the country that had educated him and to which he had sworn an oath of allegiance. The Harper's Ferry raid ignited emotions across the country: fear and rage in the South, astonishment in the North, and in many Northern hearts, admiration. There comes a time in every man's life when thinking needs to be connected with doing. Now, we all knew, politics being what it is, that no matter what Brown or anyone else said in his defense, that he would be hanged. I decided to speak in his defense all the same. This decision proved quite controversial. I was actually approached by 2 ministers of all places, the Concord Anti-Slavery Society, who asked me not to speak for fear that I would inflame the situation, as if the times were not already inflamed. Oh, people thought, boy, that Henry Thoreau, he sure has a lot to say for a man who squats on another man's land and borrows another man's axe. That wasn't the point. I didn't come out here to own something. I came here to learn something. And that axe I borrowed was sharper when I returned it than it was when I borrowed it. Now, I'm not saying that every man should run off to the forest to chop his own wood. We're not all built the same, but there is something healthy and universal and beautiful in places like this. Our lives would stagnate if it were not for the tonic of wildness. At the same time, we're meant to learn and explore all things. I think we need some places to remain mysterious, wild places unsurveyed and unfathomed by us because they're unfathomable. We need to see life thriving freely where man never wanders. Have you ever noticed how a single gentle rain makes the grass many shades greener? That's how our prospects brighten with better thoughts. We should embrace the present always and not waste our time worrying about past opportunities. The first sparrow of spring is a wondrous thing, so full of hope. The marsh hawk sails low over the meadows, seeking the first signs of slimy life that awakens. You can hear the sound of melting snow and the ice dissolving in the ponds. The grass flames up on the hillside, as if the earth had sent forth an inner heat to greet the returning sun. A single blade of grass is a symbol of perpetual youth, growing forth from the sod, checked by the sod, but reaching forth into the sky. Much in the same way that our human life dies down to its root, yet still puts forth its green blade to eternity. I think I'll continue now with my saunter and wish you all a light and sure step on yours.